Welcome to everyone that's listening in. Thanks for joining us again for another one of these fireside chats between Phil and myself. For those that may not have dialed into the first one, we're doing a series of webinars just chatting around Essential 8 and a bit of a deep dive into the controls that Essential 8 looks for. And one of the things we've seen over the last few years of doing a lot of audits is just a lot of inconsistency in the interpretation of controls and what the intention of those controls are. And what we're finding is a lot of organisations are doing sort of automated scans to try and understand their alignment to Essential 8, but tools alone can't evaluate your alignment to the maturity levels. And so without that business context, it's really hard to get an accurate view. So what we're finding quite challenging is that organisations think that they're aligned, but then once the business context comes into play, that they may find that they actually aren't in tow or in step with the expectations of Essential 8. Hence these discussions. Phil, thanks again for joining. Last week we spoke around the patching controls. Today I'd love to dive a bit more into two more of the controls. We're going to bundle two more together: Microsoft Office macros, restricting of macros, and user application hardening. Bundled them together. Maybe start by getting you to give me a bit of a rundown of what these two are, how they may tie together a little bit, and I guess what they mean for organisations.
Sure, Alex, no problem. I'll start off with application control. So I guess the core crux of it, Alex, is for organisations to get a handle on the applications that are running within the environments. It helps, application control helps stop, the creep of shadow IT applications and systems that get provisioned in organizations. It's trying to put a handle on that and control that, as well as to stop any nefarious activity. So application control can be used to, protect organizations, for example, against malicious actors. If there's, an example of that would be if a Microsoft process which is allowed to execute, if it tries to spawn off a secondary process which isn't on the list of approved applications, that's when application control would come in and it would block that nefarious activity. So it's twofold: stops malicious activity, and also helps the organization understand truly what applications they have permitted to execute in the environment. So just to keep that all nice and audited for compliance purposes also.
Sorry, mate, can I dive in there before we go into the macro controls? Just on that, that's something that we see quite a lot of. I won't say inconsistency, but confusion with application control. What we hear a lot is from the IT team, MSP, we've restricted administrative access on the device, so we've enforced application control. That's not correct, right? That doesn't meet the requirements.
Two different things. Yeah, that's two different things. So obviously restriction of local admin privileges is a good thing. People should be doing that inherently as best practice. But as I mentioned earlier, if there's an application that's permitted to run, let's say like an Office app that's permitted to run, and although that the organization has limited local admin privileges, if an attacker can exploit that, that application in an organization that doesn't have application control and is able to spawn up a process using local system privileges to download malicious software to the machine, that's going to pass right through. Having application control in place will actually mitigate against that. Although the application could run as local system, the actual process would be blocked because it's not it's a piece of, that software is not on a trusted list of applications to execute within the environment, if that makes sense. So you're right, two different things. Organizations do tend to get that a bit confused from what I've seen conducting the audits.
Yeah, and it's I agree. It's really common to see that confusion and to hear that statement when we talk to that particular control as well. I've already restricted local admin.
That's
and to have that conversation. Sorry, I did sort of jump in there and pivot a little bit. With Microsoft Office macros, pretty straightforward in terms of what the name suggests.
Yeah, yeah. So Office macros is a bit of a tricky one from what I've seen. Obviously, the restriction of macros is to limit the risk of organizations downloading, I guess, malware from within a file that's macro enabled. So what threat actors tend to do is put in, I guess, JavaScript code into Word documents, which organizations or staff usually think it's safe to, I guess, to open. And upon just opening the file, depending on how the threat actor has configured his attack, usually it can automatically load, reach out to a website, pull down malicious code, and it can at times, ransomware the machine or spyware gets downloaded to the machine without the individual user actually noticing it. So that's why it's important to, I guess, for organizations to take macro controls seriously, and a bit of a focus on that. And from what I've seen, as the ACSC recommend, right, restricting it to only those staff members that actually require the access to macros within the organization. And even then, Alex, by permitting it, they also recommend that the macros be signed by publisher, or that it's only allowed to run from a trusted location. So it's like there's specific guardrails that if you're going to enable that in your organization, to put those guardrails around that capability, if you'd like.
Does it create, so, and I think again, misconception there in terms of that control of restricting Microsoft Office macros, it's not saying disable, or just disallow. And I think there is a confusion that comes from that. But by implementing that restriction and to only those people that are allowed to use macros and to signed authors or documents, publishers, how much admin overhead does that create? Like, does it create a massive burden for organisations to implement and to govern that?
Initially, if the organisation doesn't have the capability internally to sign their macros, it could be a bit of a challenge for them to get it going. But then again, there's multiple ways that the ACSC recommends on how organizations can interact with macros, macro-enabled documents. So one could be allowing it access from a trusted location. The other could be the setting a signed publisher, like creating a certificate, applying it to that macro. So there's various ways to do it. I guess the main intent there is for organizations just to be mindful and controlling who has access to macros and how users interact with macros. I guess that's the main takeaway is don't have it open for everyone who doesn't need it because you're just opening yourself up. Restrict it to typically it's more, I guess, staff that work in finance departments that interact with spreadsheets a lot. Lock it down to them, and also, I guess, increase visibility via monitoring to see what's going on in those environments.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I must admit, as you're chatting now, I'm thinking about accountants primarily and how they deal with it, because obviously a lot of macro-enabled spreadsheets. So it really is, and this is going back to that earlier point around there's some tooling or technology requirements to block this, but a big part of Essential 8 alignment is establishing procedures, the governance procedures, I say the workarounds, but those processes to be able to enable where required. So E8's not suggesting, again, to that earlier point, just block, shut down stop your business from operating. It's more around
No,
having structure around these controls.
that's correct. Having the structure and understanding the business context. As you know, business has to continue to operate, and if that's a core component of an organization, it's just securing that and putting the appropriate guardrails around that. Like you said, the process is very important there.
Yeah, yeah. So just extending on that, so there's obviously 3 maturity levels within Essential 8. If we look at, let's keep going on the macros first of all, and then maybe have a look at back to application hardening. What do I need to do to achieve ML1 for these controls? What do I need to do to ML2? And then what's the complexity and requirement to get to the highest level of maturity for these 2 controls?
Yeah, so level 1 maturity level starts off with the more basic controls regarding macros. So that's something like ensure that macros are scanned by an antivirus software on the machine. Ensure that macros that are coming in from the internet are also scanned. Then as you move up the maturity levels, it gets more, gets more in depth with the controls. So as you know, the Essential 8 is heavily focused on Microsoft. So depending on the organization's level of licensing, some organizations will have access to Defender for Endpoint. And I guess Defender for Endpoint's got a suite of controls, ASR controls, attack surface reduction controls. And a lot of these controls tick off the macro components of the Essential 8. So it would be settings such as do not allow macro-enabled documents to spawn off a process, for example, within the environment. Those sort of controls are coming into play as you move up the maturity level. And then finally, when you start getting to maturity level 3, that's where you start getting into where the logging of these activities, like you'll notice a theme as you get up to the maturity level across all the mitigation strategies where they start talking about centralized logging and monitoring. So that's referring to a SIEM type solution. So the analysts within the organization have a bird's eye view of what's going on across the infrastructure. So that's how it slowly increases in, I guess, complexity and capability.
Yep. Without diving too far into SIEM, you probably know where I'm going to go here, but Essential 8 doesn't explicitly call out the need for a SIEM. It talks around central logging, and I know this is a little bit of a pivot, and this looks more broadly at Essential 8, I think, because there's obviously that concept of centralized logging for a lot of these controls. Do I need a SIEM?
The short answer is no. Not every organization is going to have the capabilities to purchase a SIEM. As long as the intent of the control is met, meaning, as you mentioned, Alex, like for example, application control would be a good example here. As long as the organization's application control solution is centrally logging the events, I guess the permitted and the blocked events within the application control solution, although it's not going to a SIEM, but it is getting logged centrally within itself. That demonstrates that the control is met. It is logging that centrally. We can go into that solution and we can go and see what's going on there. The same for if you extend that to, I guess, Entra ID. As long as the correct logging and monitoring is enabled within the environment, that's all getting logged essentially into, I guess, Entra ID, whether it's group memberships, elevation in roles, it's all getting logged in Entra ID audit log. So yes, although we don't have a SIEM, there is a way to go back and have a look at that within the 90-day period, whatever the setting is over there. Ideally, having a SIEM is great. A SIEM/SOC service, if you want 24/7 eyes on glass, that's, I guess, that's the ultimate for visibility, and it's all in a single pane of glass for, I guess, easier management.
Yeah, and a really good point, because I always think back to, what's the driver? if you're looking to align to Essential 8, is your driver to tick the box and demonstrate, or is your driver to actually manage risk? I think obviously taking those two lenses will determine a little bit whether you invest in Siemens SOC services or not. But I think core recommendation is always going to be from our side to invest in those services, even though technically you may not need to demonstrate alignment to EA.
Yeah, it just makes it a lot simpler, or I guess a lot easier. I wouldn't say simpler, a lot easier to, keep your finger on the pulse if you're just monitoring one dashboard versus logging into, I don't know, 10 to 15 disparate systems. It just makes it easier for the analyst to, keep his finger on the pulse as such.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier around the Microsoft focus of Essential 8, and I know we touched on this with the patching controls last week as well. We were talking around that. And what does that mean if I'm not running a Microsoft environment? If I'm not running a Microsoft environment again, what does restricting Microsoft Office macros mean in a non-Microsoft environment for E8 maturity alignment?
If you're not running it on if you're not running a Microsoft environment, like if your machine's a Linux machine, okay, then I guess that's not, in regards to macros, yeah, okay, that won't probably mean much, but as in an environment as a whole, so most environments have a mixture of, I guess, Linux, macro, and Linux, Mac, and Mac OS operating systems. So environment as a whole, I would always recommend that they do implement those controls as best practice, regardless of the operating system that the user is running, just to have that in place, because most organizations, well, corporate organizations out there will have a Windows footprint, and it would be good just to have that coverage. Also, a lot of the E8 controls can extend themselves to different operating flavors. I guess the intent is the same. If we talk about, for example, application control, that can also lend itself out to, I guess, a Mac system. So you want to always ensure that only permitted applications are to run within the environment. So that lends itself to Mac, Linux, or Windows. You want to keep that consistent as much as possible.
Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of assessments over a long time, and I touched earlier on that one of those, the most obvious ones that we see, which is that inconsistency in terms of interpretation for local admin restrictions. But from the assessments you're doing across, particularly in relation to these controls, what are the most common mistakes or misconceptions, learnings that you've had over the last few years in relation to these two controls? Are there consistent themes that you're seeing?
Yeah. So what I've seen consistently, I've noticed that during the assessments, although a lot of organizations have implemented some of the E8 controls and they think that the controls are, I guess, working as expected, or because that's been configured inside the environment, when we dig deeper and we do a bit of controls testing, we pick up that the controls aren't actually fully in effect, and a lot of them tend to fail the tests. So I guess what's important for organizations to do is actually to validate and test the controls that they are implementing, ensuring that they are applying correctly to all the devices within the environment. That's one thing that I've noticed, and that comes up basically every assessment that I've done. The organization thinks, as you mentioned, they're in a good spot or in a better spot than what they are. And when we run the actual test to test the control, to validate the controls are doing what they need to do, some of them fail. And that's something that I'd recommend that organizations use the controls testing component when implementing the controls.
Yeah. And that's, again, is that a combination of, that's the combination of running technical tests, but then being able to take that business context, right?
Correct. So it's both. It's the it's both. So, for example, that if we talk about application control, from what I've seen is, or there's a, I think it's maturity level 3 where they ask whether the approved set of applications, whether they're reviewed annually, at least annually. That's more of a process. Organizations say yes, but we ask them to, demonstrate where that's captured, how that's done. We find out that the process is probably not being followed as they thought it was. So that's a process thing, Alex, and then there's also, I guess, a technical component to that with regards to the controls testing. So we look for both to understand the full context when we do the assessments.
Yep. With these two controls, can I get there to a certain level of maturity just using Microsoft native capability? Or do I need third-party solutions?
You can do it with Microsoft native technology. It's going to be a lot more challenging, though, for the implementers or for the tech team, because I guess, like if we take Microsoft, for example, they use WDAC for application control. It's not as friendly as more of the popular solutions that we get out there today. It's a lot harder to get devices and servers into enforcement mode using native Microsoft tooling. It's been my experience versus using the more popular application control tools. So short answer, yes, it is possible, but it's going to take a lot more effort from the team.
That's a really good point you make around getting to enforcement mode. Can you just talk to that process of implementing app whitelisting, right? App listing. What's the process? What's that journey actually look like for an organisation? Because I've seen in some cases where organisations have figured that they've turned a couple of switches on and locked it down and said we've got app whitelisting in place. But what's the actual journey look like? Over what period of time on average? Because I think it's a lot more complex, than a lot of organisations realise.
Yeah. From like my experience working with different organizations and in different organizations. So commonly the way we go about it is naturally deploy the application control agents. So this is not using the Microsoft native tools. So using a third-party tool that does application control well, deploy the agents within the environment, decide whether it's going to be deployed to workstations and servers or just workstations or servers. Once deployed within the environment, usually they recommend a month worth of learning mode. Okay, so you are going through that process, discovering all the applications, and then working with business stakeholders to understand what we are seeing. Because as soon as you go down this path, you'll pick up other thousands of applications will flag, depending on the size of the organization. It's a bit overwhelming to start off with. And then you slowly start chipping away, speaking to business units, understanding the applications, cleaning things up. And once your hit rate of discover applications or untrusted executions hits 0, as you start approving the apps, the legitimate apps, once you get to like a relatively, I guess, acceptable number, that's when you typically flick the switch over to enforcement mode once you've gone through all that and you've gone through your auditing and working with the business to understand applications. With that, they say a month is enough, but in reality, you probably give it 2 months, depending on the size of the business, is probably more realistic. And why I say that is certain application control applications only pick up all the executions of the machine once, for example, a server has done a reboot cycle. So depending on patch management and how often servers are rebooted, if you deploy an agent to a server, it will capture all the executables, but certain executables only trigger once upon reboot, and you want to capture that. So you just got to be mindful on the process, as you mentioned. So typically, I'd say 2 months to be safe would be, a good.
And what does that get me to? Is that a maturity level 1, maturity level 2 sort of state of being, or where do we get to at that point?
Yeah, depending on the application control solution, but the more popular ones will get you pretty much to a 2 straight away. If you choose to enable, for example, command long, or the PowerShell type controls, the Microsoft recommended block rules, those sort of things are natively integrated into a lot of the new application control applications. And if you tick those options on, you can climb up that maturity score or level pretty quick with the third-party tools.
Yeah. And just in the scheme of the broader E8, and conscious we're almost at time here, Phil, that's gone very quickly.
It has.
In the scheme of the broader E8, where do you place this one? Right? It's a tricky one or a lengthy one to implement, but in terms of its impact to reducing risk, where do you place it against the rest of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll place it from one being the most important down to 8. I'll probably put this one around probably around a 3 or 4, Alex.
Okay, so it's in the top 4.
It's at
So
the top.
it is
Yeah, I would personally.
it's an important one because it has such an impact on reducing the most common risks that are out there.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, if you've got a solid application control solution implemented in the environment, it can stop a lot of bad things from happening, as it's all only, as mentioned earlier, only to permit trusted executions to run in the environment.